This video is about a man whose Chadliness that was so overwhelmingly overpowered that over half of Europe was eclipsed and submitted by it. This Chad's cojones were nearly as big as he was, despite his stature. He used his tactical genius and mind for warfare to slam dunk on his enemies until they were forced to gang up on him. This is Chads of History, and this episode is on Napoleon Bonaparte. He was born in 1769 in Ajaccio, Corsica, of Tuscan nobility. His father's family had immigrated to Corsica sometime in the 16th century. At a young age, Napoleon was sent to the Continental France to obtain his education in kicking butt and taking names. But if one school wasn't enough of a headache, he attended three. The first being the Collège d'Autun, or for convenience sake, Autun. But then he went to a military college and spent 5 years learning in Brienne. After that, he got his master's in Chadology after another year at a different military academy in Paris. It was the year 1785, and his dad died of stomach cancer, and this left his family in a tight spot. So Napoleon, being the Chad he was, took control and became the new head of the family. Bear in mind, he hasn't even turned 16 yet. After graduating the military academy, he joined a training school for green artillery officers. In this school, he was made second lieutenant of artillery in the regiment of La Fère. He returned to Corsica in 1786 with a newfound belief that political change was necessary. So skip forward a little bit. It's 1789, and the French National Assembly had just established a constitutional monarchy, which is basically when the government teams up with a king for some reason. So Napoleon asked for leave and went to Corsica to see a guy named Pasquale Paoli, a former Corsican leader who resisted the French when they came to take Corsica. Well, Napoleon tried to join up with old Paoli. The only problem was that Paoli was still pissed off that Napoleon's dad negotiated with the French while he ran away and left him hanging. But it's basically a moot point now, because the French ate Corsica and all their military leaders. Well, Paoli isn't exactly fond of Napoleon because he's the son of the guy he doesn't like. Anyway, he got rejected by Paoli and went back to France. In 1791, Napoleon joined the Jacobin Club, which is some unchadly debate society that had a weird fondness of constitutional monarchies. Well, soon he became in charge of that group and started smack-talking prominent monks, bishops, and nobles. In September 1791, he went back to Corsica for a little while and got elected lieutenant colonel of the National Guard. But then got sick of Paoli's shit. Then he went back to France, but somehow got lost or something, and was labeled as a deserter, but was forgiven when France went to war with Austria, as they had a dire need for his Chadly insight. Alright, so after raising enough money on his Patreon account, Napoleon was promoted to captain, but he didn't go back to his old dingy regiment. Instead, he had a bone to pick with old Pasquale, because since he's been gone, Pasquale Paoli basically became a dictator and wanted to revolt or succeed from the French and obtain Corsican sovereignty. In April 1793, civil war had broken out in Corsica between Paoli and the Corsican Jacobins who opposed him. Alright, so instead of giving it to Pasquale, Napoleon rejoined his regiment in Nice. By August 1793, the French National Convention soldiers had taken Marseille and continued on to Toulon, where they were intercepted by the Royalists backed by British forces. The commander of the French artillery was wounded in battle, and Bonaparte rose to the challenge and took his place. He was soon promoted 2 times in 2 months up to adjutant general, or the chief assistant to the general. At one point during the skirmishes, Napoleon had received a bayonet wound on December 16th, but his artillery were still able to drive back the British, and they soon fled Toulon. In December 22nd, at age 24, Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general for taking the town. In February of 1794, Napoleon was appointed to commandant of the artillery in the French army stationed in Italy. Well, at some point he gets charged with conspiracy and treason, but not much really comes from that, as he's basically free shortly after. But he didn't go back to his old post commanding the artillery, as to him it was a dead-end job that had no potential for advancements, and that simply goes against Napoleon's Chad code. So he went to Paris, had an affair with a daughter of some rich guy, and he also wanted to find a better position of command. This was difficult for him, as everyone feared his ambition, his ties to the Montagnards, or mountain men. They were basically radical Jacobins of the French National Convention during the French Revolution. This had him so peeved, he even considered becoming a mercenary for the Sultan of Turkey. Alright, so fast forward a little bit. Napoleon is in Paris of October 1795, and the National Convention is changing around their constitution a little bit and trying to re-elect 2/3 of their current members. The Royalists, or the people who want to restore the monarchy, started a revolt in Paris to essentially cock-block the National Convention's plans. So there's this guy named Paul Barras, and at the time he had dictatorial powers granted to him by the National Convention, and he remembered how much of a Chad Napoleon was at retaking Toulon and wanted him as his second in command to squash these rebels. So that's exactly what he did. His forces battled the rebels and saved the National Convention. Okay. So after Napoleon became the commander of the Army of the Interior, which is basically 2 armies consisting of French revolutionaries, so now at this point he was also an advisor to the military and the new government called the Directory, which is the government set up by French revolutionaries. Around the same time he began to rizz up this fine babe, Josephine Tacher de la Pagerie, who was the widow of some guy who got his head cut off during the Reign of Terror. The Reign of Terror was a 10-month period of harsh measures taken against enemies of the revolution, which brought a wave of executions along with it. Anyway, apparently this Josephine lady was also known as a woman of many love affairs. You can draw your own conclusions as to what that means. Alright, so now after proving himself on numerous occasions, Napoleon was promoted to Commander-in-Chief of the Army of Italy in March of 1796. This was a position he had been vying for a while now. Alright. So then he married Josephine on March 9th and left for the army 2 days later, leaving Josephine back to her other numerous love affairs. So upon arriving in Nice, Napoleon had found out that his supposed 43,000 men army was actually only 30,000, who were also hungry, underpaid, and not properly equipped. But this video is about Chads, and Chads can work with anything, especially the bottom of the barrel. So on March 28th, 1796, he made a speech to his troops. "Soldiers, you are naked, badly fed. Rich provinces and great towns will be in your power, and in them you will find honor, glory, wealth. Soldiers of Italy, will you be wanting in courage and steadfastness?" To which I would just say I'm happy to be fed. On April 12th, he marched against the Austrians and the Sardinians at the Battle of Lodi, and then beat both of them and proceeded on to Turin. So King Victor Amadeus III of Sardinia asked for mercy, and at a peace meeting in Paris on May 15th, Nice and Savoy was given to France. Napoleon continued against the Austrians and got held up in Mantua. Alright, so now Napoleon has begun to besiege Mantua, which was apparently easy to do as the Austrians had deployed their troops too far apart from each other, which effectively made it easy for Napoleon to divide and conquer the 2 armies. After some battles and skirmishes, Mantua surrendered on February 2nd, 1797, and the French had kicked the Austrians out of northern Italy. All the while this was happening, Napoleon had also signed armistices, or temporary peace treaties, with the Duke of Parma, the Duke of Modena, and even the Pope, Pope Pius VI. So now Austrian armies had tried about 4 times to retake Mantua to no end, and got their asses handed to them by Napoleon every time, which to me seems a bit masochistic after the second defeat. After that, he thought it was about time to hit the Austrians where it hurts, right in their capital, Vienna. But before he could get there, the Austrians chickened out and pushed for an armistice, to which they were granted, but only after Austria surrendered northern Netherlands to France. Meanwhile, some of the royalists were getting elected to office, and this didn't sit right with Napoleon, so he asked the Directory to have his back, and if it comes down to it, to fight them. So on September 4th, 1797, there was this event called the Coup d'Etat of 18 Fructidor, year 5, which is some really fancy way of saying, we're kicking all the royalists who oppose us out of government. Alright, so after Napoleon was able to get the Austrians to sign the Treaty of Camp Formio, which signified French victory of the Austrians in Napoleon's first Italian campaign. Unfortunately, this pissed off the Directory because the treaty gave Venice to the Austrians for some reason, and because they didn't secure the west side of the Rhine for France. But the Directory aren't Chads, and people still liked Napoleon for his victories. Alright. So now the French are continuing another war with the British, and the Directory wanted Napoleon to invade the British Isles, but the British were Chads themselves when it came to the sea, and Napoleon wanted to weaken them and bolster his navy. So he did this by striking out at Great Britain's moneymakers, prominently Egypt and India, and the Directory thought it was a great idea because they fucking hate Napoleon. So Napoleon took Malta, which is some old fortress that used to house a bunch of Hospitaller knights, and then on July 1st, 1798, Napoleon took Alexandria. But then the French naval squadron was massacred by Admiral Horatio Nelson at the Battle of the Nile. The second Battle of the Nile. I don't know how many battles there's been there, but probably a lot. So now, without any ships to go back home, Napoleon decided to assimilate his newly conquered Egyptians, but then Turkey declared war on France because Egypt was essentially their vassal state. So as a response to this, Napoleon marched into Syria on February of 1799, and then stopped at Acre, where I guess he fought it out with the British once more and was forced to retreat south, back to Egypt. So now Europe had basically witnessed Napoleon getting his lunch money stolen, and they decided to form their own gang, the new coalition against France, consisting of Great Britain, Austria, Russia, and Turkey. After this, French forces were forced to leave Italy in 1799, and there was this guy named Emmanuel Sieyès, who had convinced himself that being a dictator is better than being a king. So that forced Napoleon to return to France to save the Republic, which really means seize power of the Republic. So Napoleon teamed up with this guy to kick the Directory out and set up a new government called the Consulate. Sieyès and Pierre-Roger Ducos were two of the consuls, but Napoleon was the one with the true power. Alright, so it's December 1799, and what everyone was expecting has happened. Napoleon is now the dictator of France. So now he's reorganizing the army and planning to attack Austria again. But now he doesn't have to worry about Russia, as they left the coalition. So using Switzerland as a means to flank the Austrians, he went around through northern Italy, through the Great St. Bernard Pass, and snuck up behind the Austrians, besieging Genoa. Napoleon attacked with around 28,000 men, with the Austrians numbering around 31,000 troops. After a Pyrrhic victory at the Battle of Marengo, the French now have control of Lombardy. After a second defeat in Germany, Austria was forced to sign the Treaty of Luneville in 1801, which gave France control of the Rhine, the Alps, and the Pyrenees. Soon after, Great Britain signed for peace, as well as Amiens, on March 27, 1802. So after peace has been re-established in Europe, the people of France were feeling Napoleon's chadliness so much that they wanted him to be consul for life. Well, sadly, this didn't last long, as after some disputes of territories, Great Britain thought it unacceptable that the French take during peace times. So they did the only sensible thing to do at the moment, and declared war on France in May of 1803. So in 1804, the British were getting sick of the pesky Napoleon and all of his Chadley victories, so they financed an assassination attempt on him in hopes that he'd fuck off. Needless to say, Napoleon found out and wasn't exactly pleased about it, so it was believed that the one who orchestrated the conspiracy was a young nobleman, Duc d'Enghien of Bourbon. Well, Napoleon sent his men out and kidnapped the guy, and then on March 21st had him shot, which in turn pissed off all the old heads of the aristocracy. But that's about it. So after some changes in government to prevent more assassination attempts, Napoleon was to be consecrated by the Pope himself so he could get more clout than previous French kings, to which the royalists thought was pathetic. And if being dictator wasn't enough, in March 1805, he was declared King of Italy. Alright, so after having some time to beef up his forces and improve his political and public views, he wanted to throw hands with the British again. So he gathered around 2,000 ships and built up a large army around Boulogne. Well, apparently the fleet he built up wasn't big enough, so he talked the Spanish into joining him, to which the Spanish were all too eager to oblige. So the plan to lure out the British squadron into waters that they couldn't easily be reinforced had failed. The admiral, Pierre de Villeneuve, was eventually chased down by Horatio Nelson and were blockaded in Cadiz in July 1805. Well, Napoleon basically called Pierre a coward for running from Nelson, so Pierre got a wild hair up his ass and charged the blockade. Good news for them was that they killed Admiral Horatio Nelson. The bad news for them was that both the French and Spanish fleets got steamrolled by the British, which essentially left the British to be free from French invasions. So after that, the British decided to start another anti-French clique consisting of Austria, Russia, Sweden, and Naples. And yes, I said Naples. Naples. So now that he can't beat up more British people, Napoleon turned his attention to the Austrians and teabagged them at the Battle of Ulm, using his strategic acumen to outnumber the Austrians 3-1. Tactical genius. Then, on December 2nd, 1805, Napoleon beat the combined forces of Austria and Russia at the Battle of Austerlitz. And at the Treaty of Pressburg, the Austrians were pressed into giving up all Italian influence, along with Venetia and Dalmatia, and even parts of Germany. Then the French proceeded to drink the Bourbons in the Kingdom of Naples, which was then given to his brother, Joe. In September 1806, Prussia declared war on France, and got uppercutted on October 14th at the Battle of Jena and at Auerstadt. Napoleon then beat the Russians at Friedland on June, and then in Warsaw, Napoleon fell in love with a blood-sucking countess named Marie Walewska. So Russian Emperor Alexander I, who could have continued fighting the French, decided he hated working with the British even more, and signed a treaty that created the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, which divided Polish provinces between Napoleon and Alexander. Alright, so knowing Napoleon can't simply invade England, he wanted to weaken their economy to the point to force revolts and to force the British to sign for peace. The only problem is everybody else had to be on board, and Portugal wasn't too keen on stopping trade with the British because that would wreck their 401ks and they'd be effectively bankrupt. Napoleon, however, being a Chad, didn't care one bit and decided to force Portugal to join the dark side. So the Spanish let the French in their lands to get to Portugal, but this pissed a lot of their civilians off. So then Napoleon kind of tried to kick out Spain's rulers because they were Bourbon. Well, this caused a complete dumpster fire of a revolt to happen in Madrid, and then spread like wildfire across the nation because the Spanish absolutely refused to be ruled by Napoleon's brother, Joseph Bonaparte, King of Naples. Well, needless to say, this didn't go well for Napoleon, so he kicked it out of there, and soon the whole Iberian Peninsula became a playground for British commander Arthur Wellesley, the 1st Duke of Wellington, to which he commanded the English, Spanish, and Portuguese forces to victory. Alright, so now it's around October 1808 at the Conference of Erfurt, where Napoleon is meeting with Russian Emperor Alexander to basically get some favors out of him later down the line. But Alexander wasn't feeling himself that day and wouldn't commit to helping him. Anyway, now Napoleon, being on the verge of quelling Spanish revolts in Iberia, had to stop what he was doing because those annoying Austrians thought it'd be a perfect opportunity to take back Bavaria. But Napoleon defeated the Habsburgs and obtained the Illyrian provinces by the Treaty of Schönbrunn. Now it's 1810 and Napoleon fever was at its peak. He even considered himself to be as Chadly as King Charlemagne. He also kicked out the nasty promiscuous woman Josephine because she wasn't fertile enough to give him a child. So he kicked her out and married Marie Louise, daughter of Austrian Emperor Francis I. Which is funny, because you can only imagine the frustration Francis would have been feeling while the guy that kicked your ass like 4 or 5 times now is plowing your daughter. Yeah, I wouldn't be happy about it either. Since the Congress of Erfurt, tension between Russian Emperor Alexander and Napoleon has been building. So as a response to this, Napoleon built up his forces in Poland and tried to intimidate Alexander. But Alex wasn't shook, so Napoleon, with about 600,000 men, began to cross the Niemen River. So the Russians used a tactic that we'll probably cover again at some point on this channel, where they retreat further and further into the Siberian cold, basically abandoning their cities or destroying them before Napoleon got there. The further he could pull Napoleon into the Russian winter, the further he would be from resupplying and more likely to fall prey to attrition. However, Napoleon's army finally reached Moscow around September of 1812. Russian Commander-in-Chief Mikhail Kutuzov met Napoleon's forces at the Battle of Borodino, leading to a bloody massacre with no clear victor. When Napoleon had returned a week later, the city was abandoned. A giant fire had also broke out, which destroyed a large portion of the city. Napoleon was forced to pull back for now. Of the 600,000 men he had, less than 10,000 of them were battle ready. This complete and utter shit show on Napoleon's behalf invigorated France's enemies. Anti-French protestings occurred in Germany, the Prussian contingents deserted the Grand Army and opposed the French, the now vassalized Austrians refused to send troops, and were also increasingly hostile towards French rule. And in Italy, people were sick of Napoleon's bullshit as well. Hell, even their own people were kind of tired of the regime. Well, after another coup d'etat, Napoleon tightened his Chadly grip and raised taxes to fund more troops. In May of 1813, Napoleon had more victories over the Russians and Prussians at the Battle of Lutzen and Bautzen, but his army was in pretty rough shape after those battles. So Austria tried to hold an armistice meeting, which would have been pretty favorable towards France, but Napoleon took too long to respond, and Austria declared war again. So now by this point, French forces were looking pitiful. Meanwhile, the coalition were growing by the day, along with German contingents turning coat. Fast forward to the Battle of Leipzig, where the Grand Army got jumped by the coalition. French armies in Spain had to retreat north to the Pyrenees, to which the British quickly attacked. Meanwhile, the Austrians attacked Italy. Alright, so now it's 1814, and France is under attack from all sides. The coalition, being a bunch of shifty bastards, announced to the world that they don't fight the French people, but only Napoleon, which could have gave them reason to not lend their support. And by signing the Treaty of Chaumont on March 1814, Austria, Russia, Prussia, and Great Britain had effectively bound themselves as allies for the next 20 years or until Napoleon was overthrown. So Allied armies had gathered at Paris, but Napoleon had maneuvered his army to flank their rear guard from the east. So while this was happening, a guy named Talleyrand, who is some prince of some important family and blah blah blah, anyway, old Tallywhacker negotiated to make Louis XVIII king, and Louis XVIII is the brother to Louis XVI, who got his head lopped off. And then, before Napoleon could get there, Paris had surrendered. So then, knowing that resistance was futile, Napoleon relinquished his position. So after the Treaty of Fontainebleau, the Allies thought it'd be funny to mock little Napoleon by giving him his own little island called Elba to govern over. He also retained his title as Emperor, more as a joke than anything else. So then he unsuccessfully tried to unalive himself with poison, but his Chad blood running through his veins essentially gave him an immune system on steroids. Then he was almost assassinated, and then he arrived on Elba. Alright, so meanwhile, back in France, people were pissed off because now they're basically reverted back to the reason why they revolted in the first place. Bourbon monarchs like King Louis XVI were now restored, and things had effectively went back to the way they were before the French Revolution. So back in Elba, Napoleon has a close eye on the political landscape of Europe. Congress was being held in Vienna regarding the fate of Europe. Napoleon had also accused Austria of stopping his wife Marie-Louise and his son from coming to join him, when in reality, she was just seeing somebody on the side and had no plans on going back to Napoleon. Her loss. Also, France had refused to pay Napoleon's supposed allowance that he was supposed to receive after the Treaty of Fontainebleau. So Napoleon did what the Chad gods whispered in his ear to do. Take action. So he went back to France, and on March 1st, 1815, he arrived in Cannes with some of his men. The French monarchy kept sending men to arrest him, but they just kept joining him because he was so freaking cool. And by March 20th, he made it to Paris. So yeah, Napoleon had basically taken back power, and all of his old men wanting him back because King Louis's brother, Louis, sucked. Alright, now fast forward a little bit. Now Napoleon has gathered an army with which he plans to march into Belgium. He then defeated the Prussians at the Battle of Ligny on June 16, 1815. Then, only a couple days later, he was intercepted by the British, led by Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, the guy who had previously kicked their asses at the Peninsular War. Now, at the Battle of Waterloo, everything was going good and dandy for the French, with victory in sight, only for that hope to be trampled when the Prussians had arrived to reinforce the British. And alas, the mighty Chad-like Napoleon was defeated. Meanwhile, back in Paris, the government had forced Napoleon to resign. On July 3rd, 1815, he had made plans to go to the United States, but he had to get permission from the British first, because they were the Aquamen of the 1800s. So they let him leave in one condition: he can't go back to Elba. They really didn't want him to go to the United States either. So they changed their minds and sent him to a tiny island in South Atlantic called St. Helena. On October 15th, 1815, Napoleon departed for St. Helena, accompanied by a group of people who worshipped the very outhouses he frequented. So now, after years of rampaging like a madman through Europe and Northern Africa, Napoleon is ready to settle down and get used to a civilian's daily routine. He had the freedom of the whole island as long as he was accompanied by a British officer, but Napoleon wanted to cave his skull in with one of the sea rocks, so he kind of just became a shut-in that read all the time. So this made Napoleon depressed, because now he's a recluse, he doesn't have a hot wife to get it on with anymore, and on top of that, it's rumored that he found out she cheated on him with an Austrian. You can only imagine this man's internal rage when he found out. His son, who was now the Duke of Reichstadt, never came to visit him as well. Alright, so now the year is 1817, and little Napoleon is starting to get seriously ill. His physicians believe he had a stomach ulcer or even stomach cancer, which was likely induced by his living conditions on the island. And when asked to change his ways to improve Napoleon's lifestyle, he effectively told him to f*** off. Now, at the beginning of 1821, his illness had exponentially gotten worse, and in March he was confined to his bed. In April, he gave his final request, which was to have his ashes left on the banks of the Seine River, while simultaneously saying it was the English oligarchy and its assassins that killed him. Now, on May 5th, he spoke his final words, "My God, the French nation, my son, head of the army." Then he died at 5:49 p.m. that day, sometime before his 52nd birthday. The stone that was covering his tomb had no name. It only said, "Here lies," but it should have said Chad. Alright guys, well that's been this week's episode of Chads of History. If you liked it, let me know in the comments. Like, subscribe, and show me some love in the comments. Anyway everybody, that's been Ben Danaman speaking. I hope y'all enjoyed it. Later peeps. Be easy.